The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of central London as 73-year-old William Bill Henderson made his way slowly down the sidewalk. His weathered hands gripped a simple wooden walking cane, each step deliberate and measured. The arthritis in his knees, a painful reminder of his years crawling through muddy trenches during his military service, made every movement a careful calculation. Bill had served his country for over 30 years, starting as a young recruit fresh out of school and retiring as a decorated sergeant major. His chest bore the invisible weight of medals earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice in conflicts most people only read about in history books. The Falklands, Northern Ireland, Afghanistan, each deployment had left its mark on both his body and soul, but his pride in his service remained unshaken. Today was like any other Tuesday for the retired veteran. He was making his weekly trip to the small grocery store 3 blocks from his modest flat, where he lived alone since his beloved wife Margaret had passed away 2 years prior. The routine gave structure to his days, something he desperately needed after decades of military precision. His shopping list was simple: bread, milk, eggs, and the special tea that reminded him of the mornings he shared with Margaret. As he walked, Bill's mind wandered to the memories that both comforted and haunted him. He remembered the young men who had served under his command, some who had come home changed, others who never came home at all. He carried their names like a sacred trust, visiting their families when he could, ensuring their sacrifices were never forgotten. The weight of leadership, of making life and death decisions, had shaped him into a man of quiet strength and unwavering principles. The neighborhood had changed dramatically over the years. Where once stood family-owned shops and friendly faces, now there were chain stores and strangers who hurried past without acknowledgement. Bill didn't mind the anonymity, but he missed the sense of community that had once defined these streets. Crime had increased too, something that both saddened and concerned him. As a man who had dedicated his life to protecting others, seeing young people turn to violence and theft felt like a personal failure of society. Despite his age and physical limitations, Bill maintained the bearing of a soldier. His back was straight, his eyes alert, and his presence commanded a quiet respect from those who took the time to notice. He wore his best coat today, a dark wool jacket that Margaret had bought him for their 50th wedding anniversary. Underneath, his regimental tie was perfectly knotted, a habit that would stay with him until his final day. The walking cane in his hand was more than just a mobility aid, it was a gift from his old regiment, presented to him upon retirement. Carved from solid oak and engraved with his name, rank, and years of service, it represented a lifetime of dedication to something greater than himself. The weight of it in his palm provided comfort and stability, both physical and emotional. As Bill continued his journey, he passed the small park where he often sat to watch children play. Their laughter reminded him of his own grandchildren, who lived too far away to visit regularly. He had taught them about honor, about standing up for what was right, about the importance of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. These lessons, passed down through generations of service members, were becoming increasingly rare in a world that seemed to prioritize personal gain over collective good. The veteran's pace was unhurried but purposeful. He had learned long ago that rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes in his former line of work could cost lives. This methodical approach to life had served him well, even in civilian matters. When faced with problems, Bill would assess the situation, consider his options, and act with precision and confidence. It was this same tactical mindset that had earned him the respect of his superiors and the loyalty of his subordinates throughout his military career. Today, however, Bill was unaware that his routine walk would soon be interrupted by an encounter that would test every principle he held dear. Behind him, moving with predatory intent through the morning crowd, a figure was watching, waiting, and planning an attack that would shock everyone who witnessed it. The peaceful morning was about to explode into chaos, and the quiet dignity of one old soldier was about to become the center of a drama that would unfold in the most unexpected way. As Bill approached the intersection where he would turn toward the grocery store, he paused to check the traffic light. His military training had taught him to always be aware of his surroundings, but age and the routine nature of his walk had made him less vigilant than he once was. He stood at the corner, patiently waiting for the signal to change, completely unaware that someone behind him had marked him as an easy target. The veteran's reflection in the shop window showed a man who had aged gracefully despite the hardships he had endured. His face bore the lines of someone who had seen both the best and worst of humanity, yet his eyes still held the spark of determination that had carried him through countless challenges. He was a living piece of history, a repository of stories and experiences that younger generations would never fully understand or appreciate. Bill's military service had taught him many things, but perhaps the most important lesson was that true strength wasn't measured by physical prowess or aggressive behavior. Real strength came from discipline, from doing what was right even when it was difficult, and from protecting those who needed protection. These values had guided him through war and peace, through triumph and tragedy, and they would soon be put to the ultimate test in a way he never could have anticipated. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the familiar sounds of a city waking up to another day. Bus engines rumbled in the distance, shopkeepers were opening their stores, and the steady rhythm of footsteps on pavement created the urban symphony that Bill had grown accustomed to over the years. It was a peaceful scene, the kind of normalcy that his generation had fought to preserve and protect. In just a few moments, that peace would be shattered, and the quiet dignity of one elderly veteran would become the catalyst for an extraordinary demonstration of justice and karma. 22-year-old Marcus Thompson had been watching the old man for the past 3 blocks, his predatory instincts honed by years of petty crime and street violence. Marcus was everything that society feared in a young criminal: impulsive, aggressive, and completely lacking in respect for authority or vulnerability. His track record included multiple arrests for assault, theft, and intimidation, though he had managed to avoid serious jail time through a combination of lenient judges and overcrowded prisons. Growing up in the rough neighborhoods of East London, Marcus had learned early that taking what you wanted was easier than earning it. His father had abandoned the family when Marcus was 7, and his mother had struggled with addiction for most of his teenage years. These circumstances, while tragic, had become Marcus's excuse for every bad decision he made. Rather than rising above his difficult start in life, he had embraced the role of victim and used it to justify increasingly violent behavior. The young criminal moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his hooded jacket pulled low over his face and his hands buried deep in his pockets. To casual observers, he looked like just another young man heading to work or school, but those with sharper eyes might have noticed the predatory way he watched other pedestrians, constantly assessing potential victims and escape routes. Marcus had elevated street crime to an art form, and he took pride in his ability to identify easy targets. Bill Henderson, with his slow gait and expensive-looking coat, had caught Marcus's attention immediately. The elderly man represented everything Marcus resented about society: stability, respectability, and the kind of quiet dignity that came from a lifetime of hard work and service. In Marcus's twisted worldview, people like Bill were responsible for his own failures, their success somehow diminishing his opportunities and justifying his criminal behavior. As he followed the veteran, Marcus's anger grew with each step. He had been evicted from his latest apartment the previous week, his girlfriend had left him after discovering his latest arrest, and his unemployment benefits had been cut off due to missed appointments. Life was spiraling out of control, and Marcus needed someone to blame, someone to take his frustrations out on. The slow-moving old man ahead of him seemed like the perfect target. Marcus had a particular hatred for older people, viewing them as privileged members of a generation that had somehow stolen opportunities that should have been his. He failed to recognize the irony that his own choices and actions were the primary obstacles to his success. Instead, he nursed his resentment like a wound, feeding it with conspiracy theories and self-pity until it became a burning rage that demanded outlet and satisfaction. The criminal's method was simple but effective: approach from behind, deliver a sudden violent shove or punch, grab whatever valuables were visible, and disappear into the crowd before anyone could react. He had perfected this technique through dozens of previous attacks, always choosing victims who appeared unable to fight back or pursue him. Elderly people were his preferred targets because they moved slowly, often carried cash, and rarely put up effective resistance. Today felt different, though. Marcus was angrier than usual, his frustration boiling over into something more dangerous than simple theft. He wanted to hurt someone, to make them feel the pain and humiliation that he carried with him every day. The old man's upright posture and dignified bearing only fueled his rage, representing everything that Marcus felt had been denied to him through circumstances beyond his control. As they approached the intersection, Marcus quickened his pace, closing the distance between himself and his intended victim. His heart was pounding with anticipation and adrenaline, the the familiar rush of approaching violence making his senses sharper and his movements more fluid. He had done this so many times before that it felt almost automatic, a twisted routine that brought temporary relief from his constant anger and resentment. The street was moderately busy, with enough people around to provide cover for his escape but not so crowded that he couldn't move freely. Marcus had learned to read the rhythm of urban life, understanding when and where he could strike without being immediately apprehended. The morning rush was perfect timing. People were focused on their own destinations, distracted by phones and thoughts of the day ahead, unlikely to intervene in someone else's problems. Marcus's criminal philosophy was simple: the world owed him something, and he was simply collecting what was rightfully his. This delusion allowed him to commit increasingly violent acts without experiencing genuine remorse or guilt. Every victim became a symbol of society's injustice, every crime a form of twisted justice that balanced the scales in his favor. The psychological gymnastics required to maintain this worldview had warped his perception of reality beyond recognition. The young criminal had no way of knowing that his intended victim was far more than just another elderly pedestrian. Bill Henderson's decades of military service had given him training and experience that Marcus couldn't begin to comprehend. More importantly, the veteran's presence on these streets had been noticed by others who shared his values and commitment to protecting the innocent. Forces were already in motion that would make this attempted attack very different from Marcus's previous crimes. As Bill stopped at the intersection, waiting patiently for the traffic light to change, Marcus saw his opportunity. The old man was stationary, focused on the street ahead, completely unaware of the danger approaching from behind. In Marcus's experience, this was the perfect moment to strike, when the victim was distracted and unable to move quickly in any direction. He had successfully used this exact scenario dozens of times before, and he saw no reason why today would be any different. Marcus pulled his right hand from his pocket, fingers already formed into a fist that he intended to drive into the back of the old man's head. The blow would be sudden and devastating, likely knocking his victim to the ground where Marcus could easily rifle through his pockets before disappearing into the crowd. It was a brutal and cowardly attack, but Marcus had long since abandoned any pretense of fighting fair or showing mercy to those he perceived as weak. The criminal's breathing grew shallow with excitement as he prepared to strike. This moment, the instant before violence erupted, was when Marcus felt most alive and powerful. The anticipation of inflicting pain, of taking what he wanted through force, gave him a rush that no legal activity could match. He had become addicted to this feeling, constantly seeking new victims to feed his need for dominance and control over others. What Marcus didn't realize was that his approach had been noticed by several observers who would play crucial roles in what was about to unfold. The morning that had started as a routine criminal assault was about to become something extraordinary, a perfect storm of justice, honor, and consequences that would leave everyone involved forever changed. The quiet dignity of one elderly veteran was about to collide with the violent aggression of a young criminal, and the results would restore faith in the idea that sometimes the universe has its own way of ensuring that justice is served. Marcus raised his fist, took one final step forward, and prepared to deliver what he believed would be another successful attack on an innocent victim. He had no idea that he was about to learn a lesson about respect, honor, and the dangerous consequences of underestimating those who have dedicated their lives to serving others. The moment of impact was seconds away, and, with it, a chain of events that would change everything Marcus thought he knew about power, strength, and justice. The attack came without warning, just as Marcus had planned. His fist connected with the back of Bill Henderson's head with a sickening thud that echoed across the intersection. The elderly veteran stumbled forward, his walking cane clattering to the pavement as he fought to maintain his balance. For a moment, it seemed like Marcus's prediction would prove correct. The old man appeared helpless, disoriented, and completely at his mercy. But Bill Henderson was not just any elderly man. 45 years of military training don't simply disappear with age, and the attack had triggered instincts that had been dormant but never truly forgotten. Even as he staggered from the blow, the veteran's mind was already assessing the threat, calculating his options, and preparing to respond. The confused civilian facade fell away, revealing the steel core of a professional soldier who had faced far worse than one young street thug. Marcus stepped forward to grab what he could from his victim's pockets, confident that the fight was already over. This confidence proved to be his first major mistake. As he reached out, Bill suddenly pivoted with surprising speed and agility, his military training overriding the limitations of age and arthritis. The veteran's elbow connected with Marcus's solar plexus in a precise strike that drove all the air from the young criminal's lungs and sent him stumbling backward, gasping and clutching his chest. The transformation in Bill Henderson was remarkable. Gone was the shuffling elderly gentleman, replaced by a man whose bearing and movements suddenly revealed his true nature. His stance became balanced and ready, his eyes sharpened, focused, his hands positioned in a way that suggested decades of combat experience. The walking cane, retrieved with fluid motion, was no longer just a mobility aid but a potential weapon in the hands of someone who knew how to use it. Marcus, doubled over and, struggling to breathe, looked up in shock and confusion. This wasn't how his attacks were supposed to go. His victims were supposed to cower in fear, not fight back with military precision. The realization that he had seriously miscalculated the situation was beginning to dawn on him, but his pride and anger wouldn't allow him to simply retreat. Instead, he prepared for a second assault, pulling a small knife from his jacket pocket and brandishing it in what he hoped would be an intimidating manner. The appearance of the weapon changed the dynamic entirely. What had been a simple assault was now a deadly serious encounter, and several witnesses who had initially been too shocked to react were now reaching for their phones to call for help. But before anyone could dial emergency services, help arrived in a form that no one, including Marcus, could have anticipated. Sergeant James Morrison of the Queen's Guard had been off duty, walking to meet friends for an early lunch when the commotion caught his attention. Still wearing his military uniform beneath a light jacket, Morrison was everything that Marcus was not: disciplined, honorable, and dedicated to protecting others. At 28 years old, he was in peak physical condition and had been trained in combat techniques that made Marcus's street fighting look like a child's tantrum. Morrison's training kicked in immediately as he assessed the situation. An elderly man, clearly a veteran based on his bearing and responses, was being threatened by a young criminal with a knife. For Morrison, this wasn't a decision that required deliberation, it was a clear-cut case of right versus wrong, honor versus cowardice, and he knew exactly what needed to be done. The Royal Guard moved with the swift efficiency that his training had ingrained in him. In 3 quick strides, he was behind Marcus, his approach so quiet and professional that the criminal didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. Morrison's first action was to control the weapon, grabbing Marcus's wrist and applying pressure that immediately caused the knife to drop to the pavement. The second action was to immobilize the threat, using a technique that brought Marcus to his knees without causing permanent injury but with enough force to ensure complete compliance. The entire intervention took less than 10 seconds. One moment Marcus was threatening an elderly veteran with a knife, feeling powerful and in control, and the next he was face down on the pavement with his arms secured behind his back by someone who clearly knew exactly what he was doing. The criminal's world had turned upside down so quickly that he barely had time to process what had happened, let alone mount any kind of resistance. Morrison's voice was calm but carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He identified himself to the gathering crowd, requested that someone call the police, and ensured that Bill Henderson was uninjured before turning his full attention to securing the situation. His professionalism was evident in every movement and word, a stark contrast to the chaotic violence that Marcus had attempted to inflict. For Bill Henderson, the intervention represented something profoundly meaningful. Here was a young soldier, a member of the new generation, stepping forward to protect him just as he had once stepped forward to protect others. The connection between them was immediate and powerful, 2 members of the military brotherhood, separated by decades but united by shared values and commitment to service. The veteran felt a surge of pride, not for himself but for the institution that continued to produce young people of such character and dedication. The crowd that had gathered was witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just a criminal being apprehended by law enforcement. It was a demonstration of the values that separate civilization from chaos. The contrast between Marcus's cowardly attack on an elderly man and Morrison's selfless intervention to protect a stranger was stark and unmistakable. Here was proof that honor and courage still existed in a world that often seemed to reward only selfishness and aggression. Marcus, still struggling to comprehend his rapid change in circumstances, began to protest his treatment. His complaints fell on deaf ears as witnesses started to speak up, describing what they had seen and expressing their disgust at his actions. The criminal who had felt so powerful just minutes earlier was now the focus of genuine anger from ordinary citizens who were appalled by his behavior. The psychological dynamic had completely reversed, and Marcus was beginning to understand that this situation was far from over. Morrison maintained his professional composure even as Marcus became increasingly agitated and verbally abusive. The Royal Guard's training had taught him to control not just his physical responses but his emotional ones as well. He knew that allowing the criminal's words to provoke him would only compromise the situation and potentially create legal complications. Instead, he focused on keeping everyone safe while they waited for the police to arrive. The veteran and the Royal Guard exchanged a meaningful look, a moment of mutual recognition and respect that spoke to the bonds that connect those who have chosen to serve others. Bill Henderson nodded his thanks, but Morrison's slight shake of the head indicated that no thanks were necessary. This was simply what honor demanded, what their shared values required, and what any decent person would do when confronted with such a clear choice between right and wrong. As the sound of approaching sirens began to fill the air, the crowd started to buzz with excitement and conversation. Phones were recording everything, and the story was already beginning to spread through social media. What had started as a routine criminal assault was becoming something much larger, a symbol of justice and karma that would resonate far beyond the immediate participants. Marcus Thompson had chosen his victim poorly, and the consequences of that choice were just beginning to unfold. The police arrived to find a scene that was remarkably well organized considering the violence that had just occurred. Sergeant Morrison had maintained control of Marcus Thompson, while Bill Henderson was calmly speaking with witnesses who were eager to provide their accounts of what they had witnessed. The contrast between the chaotic aggression of the attack and the disciplined response that followed was immediately apparent to the responding officers. Detective Inspector Sarah Chen was the first ranking officer to arrive at the scene, and her experienced eye quickly assessed the situation. She had worked these streets for over 15 years and had seen countless cases of violence against elderly victims, but this one was clearly different. The presence of the Royal Guard, the obvious military bearing of the victim, and the angry mood of the witnesses all suggested that this would be more than just another routine assault case. Marcus Thompson's luck continued to deteriorate as additional details of his criminal history began to emerge. A routine background check revealed that he was currently on probation for a previous assault conviction and had been specifically warned that any further violent incidents would result in immediate imprisonment. His attack on Bill Henderson wasn't just another crime, it was a direct violation of his probation terms that would trigger mandatory sentencing guidelines. The weapon charge added another serious dimension to Marcus's legal troubles. Carrying a knife in a public place was a significant offense in itself, but using it to threaten an elderly veteran in broad daylight demonstrated a level of callousness that even hardened criminals found shocking. The witnesses were vocal in their condemnation, and their testimony would make it impossible for Marcus to claim that the incident was simply a misunderstanding or moment of poor judgment. As Detective Inspector Chen interviewed the witnesses, a remarkable picture began to emerge. Multiple people had observed Marcus following Bill Henderson for several blocks before the attack, clearly stalking his victim and waiting for the right moment to strike. This premeditation would transform the charges from simple assault to more serious offenses that carried much heavier penalties. Marcus's attempt to portray himself as the victim of circumstances was crumbling under the weight of objective evidence and witness testimony. Bill Henderson's statement was delivered with the precision and clarity that his military training had ingrained in him. He provided exact times, detailed descriptions, and a calm, factual account that impressed even the experienced detective. There was no emotional exaggeration or vindictive language, just a professional recounting of events that demonstrated both his credibility and his character. The veteran's composure under stress was evident to everyone present, reinforcing the injustice of Marcus's unprovoked attack. Sergeant Morrison's intervention was being hailed as heroic by both the witnesses and the responding officers. His quick thinking and professional response had prevented what could have been a much more serious incident, potentially saving Bill Henderson from severe injury or worse. The Royal Guard's actions embodied the best traditions of military service, protecting the innocent, standing up to bullies, and putting the welfare of others above personal safety. The media attention began almost immediately. News of a royal guard protecting an elderly veteran from a criminal attack was exactly the kind of story that captured public imagination and went viral on social media. Videos taken by witnesses were being shared thousands of times, accompanied by commentary praising Morrison's heroism and condemning Marcus's cowardly behavior. The narrative was simple and powerful: good versus evil, honor versus cowardice, justice versus crime. Marcus Thompson found himself at the center of a media firestorm that portrayed him as the embodiment of everything wrong with modern society. His criminal history was examined in detail, his failures were catalogued and broadcast, and his family's troubled background became tabloid fodder. The young criminal who had thought himself so clever and powerful was being exposed as a pathetic figure who preyed on the vulnerable because he lacked the courage and discipline to make something positive of his life. The legal proceedings moved with unusual speed, partly due to the clear-cut nature of the evidence and partly because of the public attention the case was receiving. Marcus's lawyer advised him to plead guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence, but the prosecution was in no mood to negotiate. The attack had been witnessed by dozens of people, recorded on multiple phones, and involved a victim whose service to his country made the crime particularly heinous in the eyes of both the law and public opinion. During the court proceedings, an unexpected development added another layer to the story. Research into Bill Henderson's military service revealed that he was not just any veteran, but a highly decorated soldier who had served with distinction in multiple conflicts. His medals included commendations for bravery under fire, leadership in combat, and service above and beyond the call of duty. The criminal who had chosen him as an easy target had actually selected one of his country's genuine heroes. The revelation of Bill Henderson's distinguished service record transformed the narrative even further. Media outlets began investigating his background, uncovering stories of his bravery, leadership, and the lives he had saved during his military career. The contrast between his selfless service to others and Marcus's selfish violence against the innocent became a powerful symbol of the choices that define character and determine destiny. Public support for both Bill Henderson and Sergeant Morrison grew stronger with each passing day. Veterans organizations rallied to support their elderly brother-in-arms, while military units expressed pride in Morrison's actions. Fundraising efforts were organized to help cover any medical expenses Bill might have incurred, though the veteran politely declined most offers, suggesting that the money be donated to charities supporting other veterans in need. Marcus Thompson's sentencing reflected both the seriousness of his crimes and the public outrage his actions had generated. The judge, in delivering the sentence, specifically noted the premeditated nature of the attack, the vulnerability of the victim, and the defendant's complete lack of remorse. The mandatory minimum sentence for his probation violation, combined with new charges related to the assault and weapons offense, resulted in a prison term that would keep him off the streets for several years. The case became a teaching moment about respect, honor, and the consequences of choosing violence over virtue. Schools began using the story to discuss character development and moral decision-making, while military academies included it in their leadership training as an example of the bonds that connect all who serve. The incident that had lasted only minutes continued to generate positive lessons and inspiration months after it occurred. For Bill Henderson, the aftermath of the attack brought both unwanted attention and genuine appreciation from a grateful public. He handled the media interest with the same dignity and grace that had defined his response to the original assault, always deflecting praise to Sergeant Morrison and emphasizing the importance of supporting all veterans. His quiet heroism in the face of adversity served as a reminder of the character and resilience of his generation. Sergeant Morrison returned to his duties with the Queen's Guard, but his actions had not gone unnoticed by his superiors. His quick thinking and professional response were formally recognized, and he became a role model for younger soldiers about the importance of standing up for others regardless of personal cost. The bonds forged between him and Bill Henderson during those crucial minutes would last for years to come, representing the best traditions of military brotherhood and mutual support. 6 months after the incident that had changed so many lives, the ripple effects continued to spread through both local communities and the broader public consciousness. What had begun as a single act of violence had evolved into something much larger, a symbol of the eternal struggle between honor and corruption, courage and cowardice, service and selfishness. The story had taken on a life of its own, inspiring countless discussions about values, character, and the choices that define who we are as individuals and as a society. Bill Henderson had returned to his quiet routine, but life would never be quite the same. His daily walks to the grocery store were now accompanied by friendly greetings from neighbors who had learned of his military service and admired his dignified response to the attack. Shop owners offered discounts that he politely declined, and children pointed him out to their parents as the hero from the news. The elderly veteran handled this attention with characteristic humility, always emphasizing that he was just one of many who had served their country with honor. The physical wounds from Marcus's attack had healed quickly, but the emotional impact had been more complex. For the first time in decades, Bill had been forced to confront his own mortality and vulnerability. The realization that he could have been seriously injured or killed by someone young enough to be his grandson was sobering, but it also reinforced his appreciation for the young soldiers like Sergeant Morrison who continued to embody the values he had tried to instill during his own career. Sergeant Morrison's life had also been transformed by those crucial minutes on a London street. His actions had earned him formal recognition from his commanding officers, including a commendation for bravery and service to the community. More importantly, he had become a symbol of the positive role that military personnel could play in civilian society, demonstrating that the training and values instilled by service extend far beyond formal duties and battlefield situations. The Royal Guard had received numerous letters and emails from citizens praising Morrison's intervention and expressing their appreciation for the military's continued commitment to protecting others. These messages served as powerful reminders of the bond between the armed forces and the civilian population they serve, reinforcing the importance of maintaining high standards and moral courage in all circumstances. Morrison kept several of these letters, reading them whenever he needed motivation or perspective. Marcus Thompson's story took a very different trajectory. His time in prison had been difficult, marked by constant conflict with other inmates who viewed his attack on an elderly veteran as particularly contemptible. Even in the criminal justice system, there were codes of conduct that condemned violence against the elderly and vulnerable. Marcus found himself at the bottom of the prison hierarchy, forced to confront the consequences of choices that had seemed so justified in his mind just months earlier. The young criminal's family had been devastated by the public attention surrounding his case. His mother, struggling with her own addiction issues, had been hounded by reporters seeking comments about her son's behavior. His siblings had faced harassment at school and work, forced to defend or distance themselves from actions they couldn't understand or justify. The ripple effects of Marcus's violence had spread far beyond his intended victim, damaging relationships and opportunities for people who had played no role in his criminal choices. Prison counselors working with Marcus reported limited progress in addressing his underlying anger and entitlement issues. He continued to blame others for his circumstances, viewing himself as a victim of unfair treatment rather than accepting responsibility for his actions. The therapeutic work required to genuinely change his perspective and behavior would take years, if it succeeded at all. Some people, the counselors noted sadly, seemed unwilling or unable to learn from even the most dramatic consequences of their choices. The media coverage of the incident had sparked broader discussions about crime, punishment, and social responsibility. Editorial writers and commentators used the case to examine questions about youth violence, the treatment of elderly citizens, and the role of military values in civilian society. The clear moral lines in this particular story made it a powerful tool for discussing more complex issues where right and wrong were less obvious but equally important. Educational institutions had begun incorporating the story into their curricula, using it to teach lessons about character development, moral decision-making, and the consequences of our choices. High school students wrote essays comparing the paths chosen by Marcus and Morrison, exploring how different responses to life's challenges led to vastly different outcomes. Elementary school children learned about respect for elders and the importance of helping others, with Bill Henderson and Sergeant Morrison serving as positive role models. Veterans organizations had embraced the story as an example of the ongoing relevance of military values in civilian life. The incident demonstrated that the principles learned through service, honor, courage, commitment, and selflessness remained important long after formal military duties ended. Bill Henderson's dignified response to violence and Morrison's immediate intervention to protect a stranger illustrated these values in action, providing concrete examples for younger veterans transitioning to civilian life. The legal community had also taken notice of the case, particularly the swift and decisive justice that followed Marcus's attack. Law enforcement officials noted that the presence of credible witnesses and clear evidence had allowed the system to work as intended, delivering appropriate consequences without lengthy delays or procedural complications. The case became a model for how violent crimes against vulnerable populations should be investigated and prosecuted. International media had picked up the story as well, with news outlets around the world reporting on the incident as an example of both the problems and solutions present in modern urban society. The contrast between criminal violence and heroic intervention resonated across cultural boundaries, reinforcing universal values about protecting the innocent and standing up to bullies. The story had transcended its local origins to become a global symbol of justice and karma. As time passed, Bill Henderson and Sergeant Morrison developed a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared values. They met regularly for coffee, discussing everything from military history to current events, their bond strengthened by the dramatic circumstances of their first meeting. Their friendship served as a bridge between generations of service members. Picture this: a decorated war veteran, now in his 70s, walking slowly down a busy London street with his walking cane, minding his own business. Behind him, a young criminal with nothing but rage in his heart and violence on his mind. What happens next will shock you, restore your faith in justice, and remind you that sometimes the universe has its own way of balancing the scales. This isn't just another street crime story. This is about respect, honor, and what happens when someone tries to harm those who've already sacrificed everything for their country. This is about how one moment of attempted violence against an elderly hero triggered a chain of events that would leave everyone watching in complete disbelief. You're about to hear a story that will make you believe in instant karma, the power of honor, and why you should never, ever underestimate an old soldier. This is a true story that happened on the streets of London, witnessed by dozens of people, and it's about to show you that sometimes justice doesn't wait for the courtroom.